So, hello everyone, and welcome to the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum. My name is Paul Adepoju, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's webinar on how can digital transformation help drive post-COVID recovery. And our expert today is Chris Locke, who is the founder of Caribou Digital. And a quick background: when you want to report on the pandemic, at different phases, at different stages in the pandemic, we had some issues that were at the front line. For instance, at the outset of the pandemic, the focus was on wrapping up diagnostic capabilities in different parts of the world. And at some time, we ventured into treatment, and there was a particular point in time when vaccine development was actually the trending topic. That we've also had issues around emergence of new variants. And today, as we are looking at another aspect of this pandemic, with vaccines rolling out across the world, various economies are already trying to reopen their economies and to attempt to gain the lost ground, no thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are looking at an issue that we believe is at the minds, is at the forefront in the race to recovering from the impact of the COVID-19, and that is digital transformation. Every aspect of human endeavor is being transformed digitally, whether it's mobile technology, whether it's healthcare, or whether it's finance or any aspect of human endeavor. If you look at fintech, before you have to go in African countries, in some African countries, especially Nigeria, where I'm based, before you can make some financial transactions, you have to go to the bank. But right now, from your home, you can actually make some transactions. So these are the issues that we believe that we'll be looking at and having an idea of the impact that they can have in the world's journey towards recovering from the impact of COVID-19. So I'd like to introduce our expert today, Chris Locke, who's from Caribou Digital. So Chris, how are you doing today?
I'm very good, Paul. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be on the webinar.
And do you agree with my opening statements?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, we've seen probably 6 years of digital transformation in 6 months in the immediate aftermath of COVID. So we're seeing a rapid kind of refiguring of the world, which we'll talk about as we go through the session.
Yes, before we start, before we go into the full presentation by Chris, I'd like to inform you that if you're joining us from Zoom today, please submit your questions on the Zoom chat, which you'll find in the menu option below. And if you're watching from Facebook live stream, please post your questions in the comments below the video. And without wasting much time, I would like to go straight into the presentation that Chris has for us. So I think you can display your PowerPoint now and go take it right away from here.
Wonderful. Great. So thank you everybody for joining. Thank you very much, Paul, for inviting me. As Paul said, we'll talk about digital transformation in the course of the seminar or the webinar today, and a little bit of how it's changing the world. Clearly, digital transformation is a massive topic that, as Paul said, covers everything from healthcare through to economies, through to work, through to lives, and covering all of that in a really short space of time is quite tough. So I've taken a very particular way of looking at where some of the big changes have been as a way of exploring the topic more broadly. So although I will focus on kind of work in the economy and how people are building livelihoods in a post-COVID world, the work we do at Caribou is much broader than that and covers digital identity and policy, et cetera, et cetera. So when we come to the Q&A, please feel free to kind of open up broader topics around the changing digital world rather than just the particular area I'm covering in this talk. So firstly, hello, I'm Chris, the founder of Caribou Digital. We're a small group of people around the world who are focused on understanding how we develop markets in general in a cohesive way. We've always been a virtual firm, funnily enough. This is a very comfortable thing for me to be on Zoom because we've never had an office, which feels like in hindsight, I knew all this was coming and we were Zoom native before anyone else was using Zoom, but it's actually far more based around the fact that when I set up the company, I don't like working in offices, so I didn't really want one. And also the people I wanted weren't all in one country, so we needed to be a bit more remote. So our focus really is to understand how digital transformation is changing the world, and to work with our clients to move that towards a better, more ethical and more inclusive social and economic benefit. So we work with a lot of the big organizations in the development industry, the World Bank, the UN agencies. We work with the UK, US and Australian governments, a lot of the private foundations, MasterCard Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, etc. And we primarily do research. So we do a lot of user research and a lot of market research to understand how people are using technology, and then to understand how technology systems are changing in countries, and then use that to develop kind of strategy and policy for how the world is changing, and how digital transformation is really something which is the most significant force of the 21st century. And this is the approach we have to digital transformation, that yes, it's about the technology, yes, it's about computers and phones and smartphones and Facebook and social media and all of these individual technologies, but actually digital transformation in and of itself is more like the weather, right? It's something that is just happening to us in the world at the moment. And our job for our clients is to really understand how digital transformation changes people's lives, and how you can understand how you get the most out of that to support individuals and to support people. So in the focus of this phrase of building back better, what I want to understand very specifically is how we've seen huge changes to the way that people work, not just in a lot of the markets we specifically work in, such as sub-Saharan African countries, Southeast Asia, etc., but more globally. What is it that's happened to the nature of work in the last year? What is it that's happened to the way that all of us find work and build livelihoods? And what can we take from the way digital technology has impacted that, and the way we've used digital technology to find work and find new ways of working, that gives us an indication of what economies and societies are going to look like, probably for the rest of the century as we go through. And this feels like COVID has been that seismic tipping point. There has been a general trend towards a lot of the things I'm going to talk about over the last decade or so. But the last year has absolutely pivoted very, very quickly a lot of ways of working towards these kind of activities. So in a very, very simple summary, a lot of what I'm going to say and a lot of what I'm going to talk about is that effectively the formal has become informal and the informal has become formal. And what I mean by that is we're seeing kind of a lot of the way people understand how they work and their relationship to employers and incomes are starting to collapse into the middle. So firstly, the formal has become informal. This is a slightly jokey slide showing something we're all very familiar with, which is how our own personal lives have started to kind of collapse into our workspace. Those of us that are lucky enough to work from home and are able to work from home have seen the kind of formality of the office, the formality of a more structured work environment collapse into the home life and building around that. So there is an increased informality in the way that people work, which I think means that a lot of the management structures and the management ways of working that we were used to won't come back. The office in and of itself is kind of a little bit of a hangover from a far more traditional kind of industrial or manufacturing basis. You know, if you are a knowledge company, physically standing people in kind of serried rows of desks in a building isn't always necessarily the best way to get the most out of them, but it owes more to kind of the shop floor of a factory than it does necessarily an office. And I think what we've all found, those of us that have been lucky enough to be able to work from home in the last year, and certainly what we've found for 7 years now of running Caribou as a virtual company, is giving people a lot more control over how and where they work is actually better for them, better for their own work-life balance, and often better for their productivity. So I think we've seen what were previously the very formal architectures of office life really collapse into something which is more informal and more something that reflects a better work-life balance. But the picture isn't 100% clear, and any of us that have picked up a paper over the last year would have seen many surveys on whether offices are coming back or not. And I think most of the time this entirely depends on who's launching the survey. So here are two perfectly contradictory examples of recent headlines. A Harvard Business School study that said that 80% of workers don't want to go back to the office. And then another study that found that 85% of workers do want to return to the office, right? I think it very much depends on where you are in your life stage, how much you need to be in regular contact with your colleagues, and very much at a personality level. Some people love working in offices, some people don't. So I think it is absolutely true that we are seeing that decay of office as a central architecture in the way lots of people's work lives are managed. And we will see that start to kind of ebb away. But it's unclear yet as to what level. Anecdotally, most of the people I speak to who do run big offices are assuming at best 50% of utilization of office space compared to what they used to have before. And most of their staff are saying they'd like an office to drop into, but don't necessarily want to go back. So there is a new informality in what has otherwise been a very, very formal architecture. And I think this goes even further and will go even further over time, particularly again, for those fortunate to be very much in the knowledge economy. If you don't need to be near an office to work and you can work from home, that also gives you a certain amount of leeway about where home is. And obviously we're seeing that in many countries at the moment in real estate prices as people try and no longer need to be near cities and can go more rural. I think we're also seeing it a little bit more extreme in some kind of freelancer areas, and absolutely in the area we work in international development. I think 70% of my staff have moved country or continent in the 7 years we've been running Caribou, and they tend to move around quite a lot because our architecture allows that. And what's fascinating for me is some countries are already beginning to look at how they can use that as a way of capturing some of these kind of high value knowledge economy workers. Inevitably, Mauritius was one of the first countries looking at this and has recently made a certain amount of press coverage about the opportunity for digital nomads to have an employment visa, allowing them to live and work in Mauritius for clients all over the world. And I think it will be very interesting over time when we look at international employment and tax structures to see where there are countries which are, good destinations for people to live in, but have previously not had the share of the knowledge economy that the major cities like the US cities and the European cities have had. Be interesting to see if we get some kind of a migration as people genuinely realize that they can work in other places that are nicer places to live and often cheaper places to live than the big cities. And it'll be interesting to me to see if some of these places get quite opportunistic about how they encourage and entice high value knowledge workers to come and live in those places. So that kind of formal architecture, that geographic center in the way that people work has really been blown apart in the last year for those that have the fortune to be able to try and pursue this way of working. But also for the vast majority of people, the move from formality to informality was not a positive and is absolutely not something to be celebrated. So the clearly major move from formality to informality that we've seen in many markets has been people's secure jobs being lost and them having to move into more informal gig economy work as a way of trying to find a living. And we've seen this huge increase in the numbers of people, particularly in the worst moments of the pandemic, when many businesses were shut down. A lot of people turned to gig economy work, either physical gig economy work, such as delivery driving and other purposes, or more commonly kind of digital freelancing and other forms of work over digital platforms. And that creates an incredible instability in people's incomes. And it creates a real danger of moving people from otherwise formal, secure, and valuable jobs into an increasingly insecure and precarious life as some form of self-employed gig economy worker. And we've seen the platforms that run a lot of these gig economy businesses hugely increase in value over a period of time, as both a lot of people have provided their labor to these platforms because they've lost their jobs and are trying to find other ways of working. And more importantly, as people have used those digital platforms themselves more and more for access to entertainment, shopping, e-commerce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is this kind of 6 years of digital transformation in 6 months that I talk about. We've been on the cusp of e-commerce, increasingly taking a larger share of retail for a number of years now, and it's been edging up. We've seen digital entertainment as opposed to kind of, in theatre entertainment, slowly increasing. And in the last 12 months, the needle's gone massively on all of those things. And this has hugely generated massive amounts of profit and value for those large tech companies that manage those platforms. Here, the classic examples of the GAFA or Vanguard stocks, but equally also a lot of the platforms such as Uber and others, etc. But we're not seeing those same benefits and that same value necessarily kind of reconfigure itself for workers. So here is an example from the Online Labour Index coming out of University of Oxford, talking about which sectors are finding work on digital platforms and which ones aren't. So we're seeing a lot of people in software development and tech have been robust. The midline there at 100 is kind of the February average for demand for these roles, where many others have seen a huge dip and then not much come up off the back. So a lot of people have been forced to use digital platforms to try and find work and use digital ways of trying to find incomes, but are not necessarily seeing the opportunities and demand there to support the increase in supply from workers. And also we're seen as a consequence of a lot more people running onto these platforms, the amount people are earning significantly decreasing as well. So if you concentrate on the first bar chart in each of these monthly segments, which is people earning less than £1,000 on gig economy platforms, you'll see a huge increase in that as we went from February into April, and then that's still there around August. So one of the consequences of more people moving on to digital platforms to try and find work, no matter what sector they're working in, is that obviously supply increases, and although demand has increased, it hasn't increased to meet supply. So the average income people earn on gig economy platforms has actually reduced, even though the income to the platform themselves and the amount of profits they're making has massively increased. And this drives a huge issue when we look at why people want to work on these platforms. And here, this is a survey in the UK about people working in parcel delivery, food delivery, and private hire transportation. Why are they motivated to work during a pandemic, despite what are obvious health risks? Fundamentally, the answer for everyone is pay. And only on the right-hand side do we see, lower numbers of people who actually didn't perceive there to be a risk. So what this chart tells us is that at a time when we were in absolutely the biggest health crisis of the last century, people who are fundamentally the very human edges of our digital platforms and our digital economies were going to work because they had to earn money, because the competition to earn money had increased. Even though the opportunities had increased a little bit, there was still a lot of competition for delivery drivers and food delivery drivers and parcel delivery drivers and taxi drivers to try and earn a living. And fundamentally, people need to secure a livelihood and need to earn money. And this, I think, when we look at the last year as a health crisis, and when we look at where employment is going, and the relationship between employment and ways of working and our ability to maintain healthy populations, is really important. When we talk about how digital the world has got in the last year, and how amazing it is that for the lucky few people who have been able to stay and work from home, everything you wanted is suddenly delivered to your door, we often forget, as I said, that there is a very human edge to all of our digital networks, that the last kind of few feet of fulfillment for most of these services, whether it's delivery food, delivery parcels, drivers, etc., are human beings who have been putting themselves at risk during a pandemic, often with very little or no PPE, and often in sometimes, very dangerous working practices, because it is the only way to earn a living. And I think this is a really important thing from a health perspective to keep in mind about the nature of the changing world of work. As we informalize work, as we take the security around jobs and replace those with more platform-driven gig economy work, we put people into vulnerable situations. We did a piece of research right when COVID hit with mobile money agents. We did it in partnership with MSc Research and looked at how mobile money agents in emerging markets were working. So for those of you that don't know, when you use mobile money systems like M-Pesa in Kenya or any other system, you send a message to the system to transfer money to someone. when they get that cash out, they do it in a very physical way by going to an agent, handing over their phone, handing over the code, and getting physical cash back. These are all high touch human to human interactions. And obviously in the course of a pandemic, those were highly risky and highly vulnerable practices. So we get excited about digital transformation, and we get excited about how the world is becoming digital. We forget how human it still is, and we forget how risky the edges of that digital system is for those humans that really kind of make it work. At the other angle, we've talked a bit about those that were lucky enough to be in formal work, kind of slowly seeing their world informalize, either for the better because it gives them more opportunities to choose where and how they work, or for the worse because it takes otherwise secure jobs and create instability around gig economy work. But for those that have been in lower income countries where work has predominantly always been informal, in many sub-Saharan African countries, 80 to 90% of work is informal. We're seeing travel in a different direction, but towards a similar middle. So in most of these cases, we're seeing people whose work would always have been informal slowly start to formalize as they use digital platforms to try and find customers, find work, and drive transactions. And this is really interesting in that opposite direction of travel, because whereas someone in a formal job going into a gig economy work is losing a lot of the capability to kind of enjoy formal employee benefits, financial services, access to healthcare, etc. Actually, those that have always been informal work that are moving more towards formal are often finding that those platforms can offer them access to digital financial services and banks for the first time, can offer them opportunities to lay away money into healthcare programs, to provide opportunities to save for children's education, etc. So although we're seeing work in general kind of collapse into that middle of informality managed over digital platforms, and in many cases, this is a real risk for people. Actually, for some groups of people, it's an opportunity. And for me, certainly, and for our work at Caribou, that's a really interesting dynamic, because it becomes very hard to say whether these two directions of travel and whether the bit in the middle, which is the digital platforms, are categorically a good or a bad thing, because actually they're both at the same time. So what we've seen, and here is an example of someone that we've been speaking to a couple of times in Nairobi, a woman called Dorcas. We spoke to her before COVID in 2019, when we were trying to understand how people were using social media platforms to upskill themselves and find work. And Dorcas was amazing. She'd had lupus, she'd had a health problem that had meant that she couldn't work and she couldn't find work in Nairobi. But what she'd done is got onto YouTube and got onto Facebook and taught herself how to bake cakes, and created a cake baking business. And she sat in her house in Nairobi, baked cakes, delivered them via a local motorbike delivery service, and had built an entire business for herself, really through social media and digital platforms. And indeed, she'd gone a step further and found a digital work platform, and was actually the travel organizer for a businessman in Russia over her internet connection as well. So for us, Dorca was a really good example of someone that had taken very informal digital platforms, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, etc., and had turned that into an opportunity to build her own business off it. She's seen, unfortunately, a lot of that business collapse post-COVID, and is kind of still doing the baking service, but is also looking at shoe sales as well. But she's the perfect example, I think, of those people moving from informal into formality. So even though WhatsApp, Facebook, and other platforms aren't built originally as kind of small business platforms, she's finding an audience, she's finding transactions, and she's doing that through that. And this has really driven huge increases for a lot of those emerging market platforms. And again, this tipping of the needle over to the other side, Jumia has seen a 51% increase in customers reached, and a 28% increase in goods sold. Huge numbers of increase for those platforms that are able to aggregate that demand in markets for those customers. But again, as more people flood onto the platform to try and find a way to earn a living and work, we're seeing people struggle. So here an example of someone in Nigeria that uses their Instagram profile to sell something which is incredibly common. We talk about social commerce as effectively people using WhatsApp and Facebook and Instagram profiles to drive their own businesses and to create storefronts for themselves. And here, as we saw during COVID, we got an example of this woman selling her luxury fashion goods online. Most people were at home with their phones. So in the early days, she ran targeted ads and reached many people and made some money. But then all that shifted in June, September 2020, because more businesses came online because they were forced to, because through lockdowns and other purposes, people were not going outside. The competition became really high and the market was absolutely saturated. And the last time actually she sold anything is in July. So again, we're seeing that factor that whilst it is an opportunity that people are able to use digital platforms and the vectors of digital transformation in general to change the way they work, the supply often outstrips the demand, and it becomes incredibly competitive to try and find customers in those spaces. And this is my final point really about this shift that we're seeing, which I think again reflects the way digital transformation is impacting lots of different sectors. In the same way it has totally changed the way that we understand how people's health is measured and managed and how people understand and access healthcare. In the same way as I've just described, it's changed the way people find work and offer themselves up for work and change the way that they're working. And indeed, in exactly the same way as people have done this with education, and more people are finding ways of doing things. We have completely restructured that world, and therefore we need new sets of rules about how we manage and protect people's lives and livelihoods within that. And this is an example from a group called the Fair Work Foundation, who are trying to come up with a set of principles around gig economy work around the world. And they're actually ranking the gig economy platforms in many countries around the world on these principles. So there is fair pay, fair conditions, fair contracts, fair management, and fair representation. And this, I think, is fundamental. We can't see these huge shifts that digital transformation is causing, and these massive shifts from formality to informal and vice versa, without asking ourselves, how do we reconfigure regulation and policy around those worlds to really make sense in the way people are living their lives now? And this doesn't mean what a lot of governments are doing at the moment, which is really looking at competition law. 20th century competition law doesn't necessarily help us. What we need is better labor law, better health laws, better education laws, understand how people are using technology and really try and legislate to how they're using it rather than necessarily an older idea of how we thought these worlds worked. So in summary, there's a few key points that kind of sum up what I was saying. Formal has become informal and informal has become formal. We're collapsing into the middle of digital platform enabled work. And there are benefits and downsides on that for different types of users. But functionally, I think we're now heading towards a two-tier economy where you either have knowledge or labor that you can use to create income. And if you have knowledge, your options are quite good, and your ability to control the way you work is quite good. I think, unfortunately, if you only have labor, it's a race to the bottom. There was a very good piece of research done a couple of years ago by the Chase Manhattan Bank and JP Morgan, where they looked at income on different gig economy platforms for US workers between, I think, 2013 and 2017. And they took aggregated anonymous data from millions of bank accounts to see how much people earn on a monthly basis on Uber, Airbnb, and other things. Where people had an asset to allow them to earn income, whether they were renting a spare room or selling things, income was relatively stable. But when all people had was their labor to sell, which was Uber drivers, actually over the 4 years of their study, incomes decreased by 50%. So we really are going to see massive inequalities between those that are able to leverage assets or knowledge and those that are able to monetize labor within these platforms. From a health perspective, I don't think I can say this strongly enough. And from a kind of social contract perspective, the edges of the digital world are human and fragile. The things that actually allow us to have more remote working, more deliveries, etc., are human beings, and our strong belief and essential need to protect those people in their lives is fundamental. And this means we need a complete total rethinking employment rights, workplace health, social contracts, etc. We need to utterly rethink, much as we did in the post-war period in the 20th century, what the social contract is with workers in this new way of working. And this, I think, is unlikely to come from a lot of the existing traditional work and labour organisations or government. It needs to come from new actors like the Fair Work Foundation, who really understand what the lived experience of gig economy workers are, and then have a sense of kind of how you can create policy and ways of doing that. So thank you very much. There's a few links there, and I'm sure Paul can send them out afterwards to both my email address and our website, our platform livelihood site, which has a lot of video interviews, we did a lot of participatory video in the last year, giving people video cameras and trainings in sub-Saharan Africa and getting them to tell us their story about how they're coping during COVID and how they're using digital technology to earn a living during COVID. And then finally, Fair.work is the Fair Work Foundation, which I would really encourage everyone to have a look at, because I think they're probably doing the best work in the world at the moment in understanding how we protect people's livelihoods in the current digital world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for that presentation. And so I have my questions for you. We can classify them into two broad groups. I have a set of questions that looks at how we can encourage or support, or you can give journalists that are interested in tracking or in reporting on post-COVID recovery through the light of digital transformation. Let's start from there. Where do you think they can be looking up to if they are interested in getting insights, data sets, or useful information that would be important for their reports? Apart from the links that you just shared, are there any personal data sources or information sources that you think they can always access?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few organizations I think who do a very good job of describing what's going on in the world through data. The first is actually the organization the Fair Work Foundation comes out of, which is the Oxford Internet Institute. I think they do a fantastic job of reporting on how people are using digital technology and the way the internet is impacting on people's lives in a lot of different ways. The other group as well, also out of Oxford University, and I'm sorry, I'm not deliberately just quoting Oxford University groups, but this is a good one, is there's the Digital Pathways School at the group at the Blavatnik School of Government. So if you look up Digital Pathways, you'll find them. They've done a lot of work again on understanding and creating policy frameworks for governments on how you cope with digital transformation and where this is going. There is a lot of stuff. There is a lot of stuff as well, obviously, from the major platforms themselves. So the results and research from Facebook, Google, Uber, etc. But obviously, massive caveat that there is an agenda in most of those pieces of research and the way that's being pushed.
Oh, thank you very much. Now, so in doing your presentation, you mentioned something that I think it's very relevant to, which is in the course of during the COVID-19, at the early stages when countries introduced lockdowns, many businesses turned to social media platforms to continue to still stay in touch with their customers, and which is this issue of saturation. And as we are seeing more online traders, more online sellers, is there anything that can be done to ensure that even though we are seeing a surge in the number of online resellers, that everybody is still able to reach as many customers as possible?
It's a tricky one. And I think this is going to be the hardest thing as more and more small businesses of every type in every country come online, is that fundamentally the problem becomes discoverability. So as you know, if you've ever tried to kind of build your own Twitter profile as a journalist, or if you've ever done any kind of corporate comms or comms work for small organizations, discovery is pretty brutal because the search engines and the algorithms that drive discovery on social media platforms or via Google are very small, and the amount of results you get on certain hits are very small as well. So one of the potential downsides would be that it becomes a real winner takes all market space, where, you know, if you've got, say, 200 shoe sellers in a city, and they all go online at the same time, the likelihood is a small group of those who are very successful will take up a a far larger proportion of the market share than they had previously. Now, this varies by type of industry. So obviously there are some things that require a level of locality. So takeaway deliveries as an example, although Deliveroo and Uber Eats and other platforms kind of own the architecture of takeaway deliveries, you're still going to have a local takeaway shop because they need to be physically close to you to deliver stuff. So I think there are a lot of proximity services where the services will be a little bit more evenly distributed. But when you look at a lot of broad e-commerce where you're just sending products to people, I think there will be a winner takes all mentality that hits the market. That means a lot of people will find themselves in businesses that aren't viable. And that's just to do with the way the platforms structure discoverability. And I think this is a real issue as well, you know, and especially when you start looking at ratings. So many people, and we've looked at it as well, have started to really analyze how ratings, you know, the 5 stars you give people when you do transactions online, really encourage and cultivate this kind of winner takes all mentality. And then also how portable those ratings are. So as a journalist, when you leave one news organization and go to the other, you take all your clippings and your writing history with you. As an Uber driver, if you suddenly want to become a Lyft driver or a Bolt driver, you start from scratch. So when we look at what the new social contract needs to be on these platforms, and when we look at the kind of regulation and legislation that we need to bring in, those are the things we look at, right? You know, if you have built up a 5-star rating on Uber and you're a popular driver because everyone knows you're good and you're trusted, you should be able to take all of that profile with you to another platform. And you should be able to have the same respect as you did before. And I think that would also help reduce some of the monopolistic practices of these platforms as well, because they would then have to compete to try and keep the good drivers on their platform with the good ratings.
Yeah, I really agree with you on the need for individuals to be able to move these credentials that they gotten from one platform to another. Then there is a question here I think is also really, really relevant in this conversation, which is we believe there is this concern that after the measures, there is movement restriction measures, the social distancing rules, the face masks, well, all of those things are eventually taken away and they become no longer required. What is the guarantee that the world will not just go back to how things are being done? What am I trying to say? I remember when the UK announced that it was ending its lockdown and pubs began to gradually open again. We saw news on social media about individuals that said they were excited to go to their favorite pubs to get their favorite beer. So what is the guarantee that when this happens, people will not just abandon the new way of doing things and just restart back to normal how we've been before COVID-19?
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how much we go back. I think there are certain things that have happened now that are kind of irreversible because people like them, right? So I think, like as I said about offices, I think, you know, if you spoke to anyone that worked in an office, it would probably be 50% hate it, 50% love it. And I think a lot of the people that don't like it don't want to go back, you know, and certainly in the larger cities where so much of your time was spent commuting. And then we were talking about this a little bit before this webinar started. I used to travel at least 2 long-haul flights a month for most of the 10 years or so before, maybe 15 years before COVID struck. You know, even in January and February 2020, I was in Ethiopia, Kenya twice, Australia for 1 day, DC, etc. Right? Most of that travel was entirely unnecessary. And I think what we have learned is in doing webinars like this, you know, it would be lovely to be in a room with everybody now, but actually doing it this way allows a far broader bunch of people to participate and allows me to do what I've done today, which is to do this, but then earlier on in the day, I was speaking to people in another country entirely. So I think a certain amount of those things are just not going to come back because it's just the efficiencies and the benefits are so strong. When it comes to e-commerce and trade, and when it comes to kind of deliveries, I think it's going to be a little bit more of a mix. I think, you know, people have got used to having a lot of products delivered to them now, and not just in Western markets with the rise of Amazon. You know, as I said, we've seen a huge rise in Jumia, and there are an unbelievable amount of startups in sub-Saharan Africa doing deliveries from local markets and so forth. And I think that becomes a little bit addictive as a consumer to kind of have that, if I click on this, it can be with me the next day mentality. And I don't know if Genie goes back into that bottle, but it'll be interesting to see how much of the more traditional kind of face-to-face activity, the pub, the cinemas, the theatre, etc., really does come back, and how much of that it has ebbed away a bit as part of our slow digitization.
Yeah, before you leave that question, let me ask, do you know, is there any sector, any industry, or any group of sets of companies that you think they've already been, they have very slim chance of going back to normal, to where they used to be before COVID-19 came
in? I worry for the conference industry. Having previously worked with an organization that ran very large conferences around the world, if business travel stops, if being in a room with many thousands of other people still feels uncomfortable, then I worry a bit about the conference industry. I think, again, it's one of those things that needs to completely rethink what it does and what it offers to people, because I don't know we will instantly go back to the kind of big conferences like CES in Las Vegas that we used to see. There is an immense value in those events, and there's a huge value in those events. It is hard to replicate virtually and with Zoom, but I think more than many other industries, that industry has to completely rethink what it's offering people. I mean, the travel industry will come back because the attraction of a sun lounger on a beach and a cocktail is not going to go away. Right.
Oh yeah, not.
No, I would love nothing more than that right now, having been stuck in the UK for nearly 13, 14 months now. But I think that kind of business event kind of travel thing, I think has got to totally come up with a different value proposition than it had before, because I don't see that being something people are going to feel like they're compelled to go back to.
So we have journalists that would like to know what you think. How do you think digital transformation will help the healthcare industry sector, especially in the light of the pandemic? How do you think digital transformation is playing out for the health sector in the pandemic?
So as I said, most of what we've seen in the last year has been this kind of really rapid shift of the needle, and that means many things that have been kind of bubbling along with slow growth have now gone through the roof. And I think we've talked about telemedicine, we've talked about digital health tracking, we've talked about all of those kind of technology-enabled aspects of health management as things that were on the horizon. And we can go back and look at the headlines probably over the last 20 years and see predictions that we were going to see telemedicine being the norm, that we were going to see digital health tracking being the norm. I think undoubtedly we are now seeing that that's going to be the norm. I think as speaking to friends I know who are GPs, they actually really quite liked being able to do telemedicine for a lot of their customers and a lot of their patients. It allowed them to see more people more frequently, and it allowed them to see a lot of people who often couldn't come to surgeries and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot of the acceleration of telemedicine that we're seeing in the last year that's fundamentally true. In terms of digital health tracking, and more importantly, understanding how digital health data plays a role, that's where I think we've seen an absolutely seismic change that is also potentially massively problematic. So digital health data is inexorably linked to questions around digital identity and digital privacy, and how we understand when it's beneficial for the state and for you as an individual to have access to certain types of data and when it's not. And we, as I said, have done a lot of work on digital identity with a lot of governments and a lot of multilateral organizations. And it's been absolutely fascinating to see how the need for COVID certificates, the need for COVID certification is just crushing the world of health data and identity into the center in a really sometimes quite worrying and problematic way. We are going to have to work out as societies, as a civilization, where the boundary levels are between how the ridiculous amounts of bits of health data that, you know, this watch has on me can be shared, and how on a transactional basis that data can be shared, and how much the state can know about you. And I think that means we need to change the way we talk about data. So increasingly at Caribou, when we talk about data, and when I talk about data with clients, I talk about seeing data rather than analyzing data. I think when people talk about data as the new oil, and when people talk about health data and some of the opportunities that that has, when we talk about it as a kind of an abstract thing that you analyze, it's somehow kind of makes it almost impersonal. We need to look at data, and very particularly health data, as people's lives. So, you know, if you were thinking, and this is something directly stolen from an article my twin brother wrote recently, but I'll steal it from him. He's my twin brother. We share same DNA, so I feel like I can steal it. But he wrote a really brilliant thing recently where he was talking about how we understand people's data. And when you click on links on websites and say, do you allow us to share your data? Would you click on those links if it said, would you allow us to share your life? Because actually on Facebook and many social media platforms, that's what you're sharing. And as we go through this huge sweep of digital transformation, your data is your life. It's a very accurate representation of your life. It's a very accurate representation of what you do. And that is only more true with health data. So I think to try and understand better where the boundaries are about the sharing of health data and how it can be useful to help us stay healthy and help run better and more efficient health systems, we need to talk about seeing health data, and seeing health data as like looking into people's lives, and have that level of respect and care and boundaries about how we do it. Because whilst we continue to talk about it as data and something that we analyze, we kind of de-anonymize it almost in the language we're using. So I think we will see fundamental shifts in the way we talk about health data in ways that try to put a more humane way of understanding where the issues and the tensions are. Because it is impossible to have blanket statements to describe you know, when health data should and shouldn't be private, and when it is and isn't useful, because it's very, very contextual between the patient and the health system.
But do you think the health sector was able to maximize tech, like in the midst of the pandemic, like other sectors, like that you mentioned? For instance, look at e-commerce, how tech adoption accelerated, even the gig economy. Were you satisfied with how tech innovations in the health space how they were able to live up to expectation, or were you underwhelmed?
So, I mean, what COVID has really done is exposed which countries use technology in health effectively and which countries don't. And I think if you look at it as effectively like a tsunami, what is left behind on the beach is really an exposure of where technology-based health systems are working and where they're not. And also what level of technology integration is useful and what isn't. Where we've seen countries that are both technologically sophisticated uniformly across their populations, and also in areas of the world that have seen similar pandemics before, you know, Taiwan, South Korea, I think we've seen unbelievable effective uses of technology, both to assess what's happening in a country and to primarily understand what's going on, but then also to use that technology as a way of informing people. Where we've seen countries, and I would include the UK as one of those countries, where the use of technology is not as well integrated and is not as well structured, I don't know it's been so good. And I think we tend to kind of, especially in these kind of emergency situations. So one of the things I did in my previous job was worked a lot on kind of disaster response technology and mobiles, and how you use technology in disaster and emergency situations. And people, I think, presume the great thing about technology is that it just allows you to kind of broadcast information out there really efficiently. And that's absolutely true. But people forget that that broadcasting of messages is really only valuable where you have trust. So one of the things I spent a lot of time early last year talking about when clients and interested parties were speaking to us was they were saying, should we develop a new app to tell people what to do in COVID? Should we develop a new website? And the answer was always no. Use the existing channels that people trust. Because what happened actually was when you looked at the Android App Store, there were suddenly a few hundred COVID apps. Now, which one of those is the one I should download? Which one of those is the one I should trust? So I think technology in these scenarios has worked where there's been a really strong architecture around making sure citizens understand and trust the digital channels that were being used to respond to the pandemic. And as I say, in places like Taiwan and South Korea, where those channels were already well established and where they'd been used in the past, there was a lot of trust there. In the UK and in many other countries, not least the US, you were fighting against fake news on social media as a way of trying to kind of win people's understanding of what was really going on and what was working and what wasn't working.
Yeah, so there is another question that I have for you, and it's the interface of talking about security, privacy, and post-COVID acceleration of growth, especially in the tech ecosystem. Some days or weeks ago, there was a good illustration of what I'm talking about was a recent update on the privacy policy for WhatsApp. And even though it's said that it will be sharing some details, some user details with other Facebook companies, but it mentions something that these particular new development, new policies do not affect individuals in Europe, implying that there are different sets of rules that may eventually start applying in different parts of the world. How do you think these peculiarities in progress regarding private policies, how do you think this would impact, how do you think this would have impact on on the digital transformation, especially the pace that we are going globally?
Yeah, so it's a big question. I think in terms of privacy regulation, the European legislation you referred to there, the GDPR, is increasingly the global gold standard and the regulation that most people copy. And if you're building a global platform and building consumer privacy systems and terms of service in there, you pretty much default to European GDPR now around the world because it's the kind of highest level of compliance. What's interesting for me is two things. And you need to assume that this is happening with platforms that are absolutely global and pan-country. What's interesting for me is two things in relationship to privacy, one at the state level and one at the individual level. Firstly, at an individual level, it's sometimes really hard, if not impossible, to understand what privacy policies mean and what those really mean for you. And most people that did leave WhatsApp and went to Signal or other platforms will have really done so because their friends recommended it or they read an article about it, not because many of them actually read the entire privacy policy and understood it. I mean, it's part of my job to do those things. And in previous jobs, when I worked in the industry, I would work with lawyers to write those terms of service documents. And I'm not sure I understand them all the time. So one of the problems with the transaction that people go into when they use these platforms and therefore exchange their data in exchange for a free service is we do this without really knowing what's going on. And again, we have to think of better ways of being able to explain to people what rights they are giving up and what access they are giving to data to people. And I think what Apple has done recently in the way it's changed its privacy policies and the way it represents that to people is really interesting because, with the latest iOS updates, it now explicitly asks you to say, do you allow this app to track what you're doing and so forth. And that's going to be interesting to see how much more that becomes the norm. At a country level, it's more interesting because I think we're seeing more countries recognize that big platforms are earning money and not paying tax in their country, and that there is a real value to the data of their citizens. And more importantly, they want to control the access to the data of their citizens for good or bad reasons, right? So I think we're going to see GDPR style global privacy policies become the norm, and we're going to see more people going further than that in the way that Apple have, to constantly ask you for approval, to make you aware of on a transaction level, rather than just when you sign up, as you're using an app. Do you really want this to happen? Are you aware that when you post this, this is where it goes, etc.? We're going to see more of that as a way of trying to explain experientially to people what it is that they're giving up. And I think services that do that well will thrive, and those that don't will start to look even more sketchy. But at a country level, I think countries will start to create variations on data privacy and increasingly data sovereignty regulation, where they will really start to limit how user data can be taken out of their country for use in other platforms. And I think that will radically reshape where data is hosted in the world, how possible it is to run completely multi-country international data platforms, as countries start to see data as an asset that they really want to try and, for political or economic reasons, have some level of control over.
Yeah, thank you. So we have, I will still take two questions, but let me start with the one from Halimatu. Halimatu would like to know whether there is a need for digital transformations like advocacy around gender-based violence. So I know you've worked with, you have backgrounds in tech, telecoms, organizations. So I think whether you can share, whatever insights you can share on this issue would really be helpful.
Yeah, undoubtedly. And actually, my colleague Savita Bailar is by far the best person to talk to here. And if you look on our Medium site, on Caribou Digital Medium, you can see the work that she and Helen and many others in our team have done looking at technology and gender. I'm going to do a very bad impression of parroting our work here, so please go straight to the source. I think the thing, so there's a few things. I think fundamentally, technology amplifies cultural behavior. And the thing that concerns us is the way technology, and particular social media, is used, amplifies controlling behavior in gender, and also creates new opportunities for gender-based violence to exist, and for clearly negative behavior around gender to exist. You know, I cancelled all of my social media accounts a very long time ago, and I started researching the use of technology and social in the early 90s, when it was still just Usenet and pre-web. But I cancelled a long time ago because I did not feel that the platforms were being policed, and I'm a white European male. Being a woman on Twitter is a completely different experience from the one I had, and I wasn't enjoying the experience I was having at the time. And I think this is the thing at Caribou that's worried us as we've seen social media become pervasive in emerging markets, is I don't think people understand the consequences of posting a photo onto Instagram. I don't think people understand how global that visibility is, and where the pros and cons are around that. And we're starting to see some of the problems we've seen in other markets increasingly emerge and become very dangerous around gender relationships in many markets around the world. And there is very little the social media platforms do to police this and manage it correctly. So it is a huge concern for us. And I think it isn't something that gets solved without the explicit protection and participation of the social media platforms that build these systems. I mean, I don't say this as a researcher and ex-academic. I say this as someone that previously worked for a lot of global internet companies where I managed community products that millions of people used around the world. And we managed them as carefully as we possibly could. We didn't make anywhere near the money that the current social media platforms make. But that's because we invested most of the money we had in moderation and policing. I think there was a conscious decision in the early 2000s, when the current crop of social media platforms came through, to just not bother.
Yeah, so I would take another question, but I think we can also be answering somebody's question on the side, at the side. So Noel Thompson would like to see the links that were at the last, on your last slide. So I think you can put that slide up again, so that anybody that would also be interested in taking those links will be able to quickly access them. Yes, Noel Thompson, I think you have the links. So please, these are very useful links. Take them, and while you are taking them, let me also take this question from another journalist who describes this person identifies as a traditional journalist. And I remember you mentioned how digital transformation has affected various aspects of life, how traders are now maximizing the online platforms to turn around their businesses, and how things have been changing. So this person would like to know how digital transformation can be useful in his career post-COVID, and essentially making benefiting financially. So can you take this question, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, fundamentally, digital transformation collapses geographies. So, the huge upside to these global digital platforms is that you can find and potentially source work from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world. So I think that should, in an ideal world, all things being equal, create a much more level playing field for people to find work and to explore work. Clearly, that still doesn't happen because a lot of the structures of privilege and the structures of finding work are physically based around a lot of the dominant cities and countries in the world. But theoretically, that's a huge advantage. I also think in terms of digital journalism, and we see this a little bit, so we do a lot of user research, and we always had quite good digital research tools and digital interviewing tools that we used, and we've only got better at them. We're at the moment at the end of a research project using WhatsApp, where we interviewed people in South America, and we didn't have anyone in country. So I think as people have got more and more used to doing far more of their communication, far more of their discussion over digital platforms, the ability to properly research a story from thousands of miles away is now there. And also we have data, right? Data journalism has been one of the most exciting things, I think, in the last 5 to 10 years, of people looking at and just, uncovering data that tells stories, data that tells us about the world and how the world is working. Most of the stories I've just talked to you about in terms of the change of work were really driven by data from the Oxford Internet Institute's iLabour project and other pieces of research. And the ability to kind of get that and tell stories around it, I think, has never been better than it is at the moment. And then fundamentally, as every small business, as an individual journalist, you have the opportunity, many have, to create your own voice on your own business. Your opportunity to create your own channels and get your work out there yourself is at least theoretically there as well, which is huge. But I think that ability to kind of get a story without always having to be on the ground is probably the thing that's accelerated the most in the last 12 months. You're on mute, Paul.
Yeah, okay. I think we can we can stop the screen sharing now. Yes, then I know we are already beyond that. We've went beyond that time. So I have one more question for you, and which is looking at the kinds of tools that have become very, very useful to us in coping with this pandemic. Do you still think there's still room for innovation to ensure that the world is better prepared, especially the workspace and other aspects of human endeavors are better prepared to still be able to survive and cope with the next pandemic more than we did with COVID-19? So what vacuum do you still think still need digital transformation that you still believe needs to be quickly achieved before the next pandemic?
Yeah, I think from a tech perspective, there will be new businesses and products that emerge in the next year or so that will be similar to the kind of wave of innovation we saw in the early 2000s when Google and Facebook and others came through, because there will be people developing businesses now opportunistically to respond to how people are now living their lives, that then find that that becomes the norm, and then they potentially achieve huge scale there. But I think if you look at kind of almost the ages of the development of the internet, the real change and the real area of innovation and activity we're going to see in the next decade is around regulation, right? You know, so we went from the internet in the 90s being relatively new and exciting and very small amount of people. Then it in the early 2000s became much more normal, and we've got social media and so forth. You know, I say to people, we look at digital economies and societies, but really I don't need to use the word digital there, right? You know, economies and societies are digital. It is, as I say, digital transformation is the inexorable change we're seeing in the 21st century. And our challenge now is to understand how we change the core regulation and policy of the way we manage the world to cope with the fact that this has happened. And that's where I think the next big challenge is. It's not necessarily in the innovation around services, which will continue apace because the markets are far larger than they've ever been. But the real challenge is, you know, how do we change the institutions of the world to be able to effectively manage that and to protect people and protect their lives?
Now, one last question. Let me still chip this in. Before COVID-19, when you look at data of tech adoption, mobile penetration, broadband penetration, we see developing countries, especially in Africa, really recording the fastest growth. But how do you think digital transformation in these parts of the world played out when the real pandemic happened? Do you think, so that is my question for you.
Yeah, so certainly, I mean, in sub-Saharan Africa, we saw, as I said, a lot more opportunistic development of delivery platforms and things like that. So I think we saw a huge creativity. And as I say, we saw a lot of what was already happening accelerating. So, you know, 3 years ago, colleagues of ours who were looking at use of technology by farmers in the agriculture sector saw groups of 40,000 smallholder farmers in Facebook groups in East Africa trading and swapping notes and selling goods, right? So, you know, the movement was already there, right? You know, the development industry has been trying to understand how to use technology with agriculture for years. Actually, the farmers just got on and did it themselves, and they used Facebook and WhatsApp and whatever platform was available to start to kind of sell their goods online. What we saw on COVID was that just became the norm and far more mainstream than it was before. And that if you were a farmer, not only were you using Facebook to find a market stall trader that wanted to buy your tomatoes, but that market stall trader was probably then whacking them in a bag and giving them to a delivery driver, to someone who had ordered them from their home, and they were being delivered that way, right? So a lot of it wasn't necessarily that there was new activity, but a lot of what was there exploded and really kind of scaled a lot more significantly. That leaves many more people behind, which is hugely problematic. And I think the digital divide, and we talk in our research a lot about rethinking what people see as digital divide when they look at policy. You know, people talk about digital inclusion as in, do you have a smartphone or not? But actually, we talk more about meaningful use, which is, if you have a device and you have connectivity, are you able to use it to meaningfully live your life in what is an increasingly digital world? And I think we're seeing that meaningful use divide increase hugely and really shift. So if you look at the pure numbers, more people have got phones than ever before, more people have got access to the internet, Facebook accounts, WhatsApp, etc., than ever before. Are they meaningfully able to use them to earn a living, to look after themselves and their family, their education and their health? Probably not. And I think that is the area that we need to focus on and address, because I think we've seen a huge amount of informal activity, particularly in sub-Saharan African markets. As I say, people using Facebook for ag, right? You know, people using YouTube to learn. And now we need to understand, how do we make these systems a bit more formal and protective and reliable for people, so that we can actually build meaningful digital economies and lives on them, rather than just it being something that's a bit ad hoc and a bit too informal in many ways, with very few protections for people.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris Locke. But before I let you go, what is next at the organization? What do you think? What is still the next focus for Caribou Digital?
Well, understandably, we've got quite a lot of work on at the moment with the way the world has gone. We're looking a lot at that last thing I spoke about, you know, how you build rights-based views into what future digital economies look like, and looking at that for clients, what future regulation will look like, and looking at, you know, how we protect individuals within these systems. You know, fundamentally, as a firm, we're effectively a human research firm. We're really interested in how people use these systems, and our guiding principles and ethics are about how we make sure that everyone has the same opportunity to build a healthy and productive life in what is an increasingly digital world. So we're lucky that we have clients that want to pay us to look at that, and also clients that are influential to be able to kind of try and shape the world better in that way. So for us, we're not a massively public firm. All of our work is online for free. Go to cariboudigital.net, look up on Medium for Caribou Digital. You'll see all of our research there. And we'll continue to do that. But we're not kind of a deliberately high profile firm. We want to kind of be there supporting organizations that can drive seismic global change, to make sure that we create the rest of the 21st century in a way that is meaningful for people, and gives them the opportunity that the best of digital platforms can.
So thank you very much, Chris, for being resourceful and for being available to answer these questions. Those are just ones that we could take within the time that we have. So for everyone, I'd like to thank you today for joining us. And I hope this webinar helps inform you better on the subject of how digital transformation can help drive post-COVID recovery. And I hope it inspires potential news story angles, and that can actually get you in new directions in your reporting. So if you are not yet a member of the ICFJ Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, please, I encourage you to please find the group on Facebook. Or for more information about the forum, please visit www.icfj.org. And if you would like to access journalism resources on COVID-19, please check out the International Journalist Network at www.ijnet.org. And please don't forget to fill out a survey that is coming to your inbox after this webinar, because ICFJ would like your feedback so that we can improve our programming in this series. So we'll be back same time next week with another interesting topic of discussion. And from here, from everyone at the ICFJ, we say have a lovely day. So bye, and thanks, Chris, and thanks everyone. Bye for now. So we are out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So bye, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you.